Yeah, I hope this workshop helps to give you kind of a basic intro to some of the fundamentals of Git, and that it helps you build a mental model of how it works. And then obviously there's a bunch more things to learn in your Git learning journey. So a couple announcements before I get started. This might be a revision for some of you if you've already started, working with Git. Some of these concepts might be things you've covered already, but hopefully I can introduce them in a way that may make you understand them more in depth. Second of all, this is a just watch presentation. So in other words, it's not a code along presentation. I would recommend to just watch the things that I'm doing and the things that I'm presenting. And I'm pretty sure, like MFA mentioned, it's going to be recorded. So you can always go back to that. I'm going to be doing questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to go through the whole presentation. And then at the end, if you have any questions, we can chat about those questions. So feel free to leave those questions in the chat, but I won't be checking the chat during the presentation. And basically the duration of the presentation is about 30 minutes. It's not very long. Git is a bit of an intense topic, so it's good, I think, to keep it short and sweet and to just go over some basics. So what we're going to be covering is Git versus GitHub, so the difference between the two. Then I'm going to be going over making a commit, but in depth. Then the staging area in depth. And lastly, I'm going to talk about branches and what branches really are and some common misconceptions about those. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be uncovering some of these common misconceptions. And yeah, let's get started. So what are Git and GitHub? So basically, Git and GitHub are often kind of misunderstood, and people think that they're basically the same thing, but they're two completely different things. Git is a program that's downloaded onto your computer, and it's a distributed version control system. In other words, it's a way to keep track of all the versions of your project and a way to collaborate with other people. Whereas GitHub is a company that allows you to host your projects that use Git on a remote server somewhere or in the cloud. It's just that GitHub is a very smart company that used the word Git in their name, which is why people associate it so closely. So if I just go to my desktop and I go into my terminal and I type in git -- version, basically it's going to tell me what version of Git I have installed on my computer. So I have version 2.23.0. But on the other hand, if I were to type in GitHub -- version, my computer is just going to tell me I don't know what that is, because basically GitHub is not a program downloaded on my computer. It's just a company that allows you to host your projects that use Git on a remote server. So the first part of this presentation is about going over how to make a commit, but really in depth and really showing all the different steps. So when we first start learning Git, we often come across these diagrams. And whereas they're kind of a helpful starting point for learning Git, I found that sometimes they can give you some, they can be a bit misunderstood. So I'm going to be offering up a new mental model of how all these components come together. So the first thing we want to do is go onto our desktop. So I'm going to cd desktop. And on my desktop, I'm going to make a project folder. So with the mkdir, the make directory command, I'm going to make a project folder called novel. And we can see that that project folder was just made over here. And I'm going to open it up, actually. There we go. I'm going to make sure to go into that project folder. So cd into the project folder. And I might refer to it as a directory sometimes. So directory and project folder, or directory and folder, are basically synonymous terms. When I first started working in the tech space and people kept talking about directories, I was like, what is a directory? I've never heard that before. So anyway, so now we're in our project folder and we're in it here as well. We can see there's nothing there. And before I go on, I want to make a distinction between two kinds of files. There are visible files and hidden files in our file system. So if I go into my user, I can see all these folders and files. And basically these are visible files. But in order to see hidden files in my computer, I have a Mac OS operating system. I'm going to press Command-Shift-Dot. And then all these grayed out files, whose file name usually starts with a dot, appear in my file system. And these are all hidden files, basically. If you're on a Windows operating system, I think you have to go into your settings in order to be able to see all of these. So now I'm going to go back to my novel project folder. And we can see that there's neither any visible or hidden files there. But we're going to use our very first git command, which is going to be git init. And with this command, I'm going to initialize or create my repository. So when I press enter, we're going to see that it says that it's initialize an empty Git repository. And this hidden file project folder or called .git appears. So if I look at what's in there, I can see that there's a bunch of things that at the moment might seem like gibberish, but very soon we'll be going over what some of these are. So let's go back to the presentation. So what we've done up to now is just make a project folder and then initialize a repository within that, which is just a folder called .git. And I want to quickly distinguish between the two. So our project folder kind of is what represents our working directory. So the working directory is sort of like a workbench. It's where you can add files, delete files, and edit files. And you're basically working on all the files in your project. On the other hand, this .git folder is kind of what represents your repository. And within the repository, there are two specific spaces that I want to talk about, which is the staging area. So the staging area is sort of like a rough draft space. So you can add files into the staging area or remove files, and you can basically craft what you want to include in your next commit so that you can be really intentional in what each commit looks like. And basically the next part inside the repository is the commit history. So the commit history is where basically all your commits live. And what is a commit? A commit is a version of your project. Each commit has a commit hash. So that's basically 40 letters and numbers that are unique. And the commit hash acts kind of like the name for the commit. It's a way to refer to the commit. So people often think that commits just store the changes between one version of your project and another version. But in reality, that's not the case exactly. Commits are standalone versions of your project. Every single commit contains within it all the files that are part of that version of your project. So this is the very first misconception that I want to debunk. Commits are not changes. Commits are standalone versions of your project. So let's go and add our very first file to our project. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code, which is the source code editor that I'm going to be using. I'm going to open up the novel project folder. And we can see at the moment that there are no files in our project because we haven't added any files. So there's no files there and there's no files here. So we're going to add our very first file. I'm going to call it chapter1.txt. It's the first chapter of my incredible novel. And we can see that that appears there. I'm just going to type in chapter 1 and then save. So now the next Git command that I want to introduce is git status. And basically what git status does is it tells us the state of our working directory and the state of our staging area. And then it tells us the difference between the two. So I'm going to type in git status and I'm going to press enter. And basically what Git is telling me is that there are currently no commits, which is obvious because we haven't made any commits yet. But there is an untracked file called chapter1.txt. And it's also telling me that I can use git add to include it in what will be committed. So basically what Git is telling me right now is that there's a file in my working directory, but this file is not yet part of my repository. I have not yet added it to my staging area. And therefore, since this file is not part of my repository, it's actually not yet being version controlled. So let's go check that out in the diagram. So at the moment, in my working directory, I have this file, but it's not yet part of my repository anywhere, and it's not been added to my staging area. So the next step would be to add this file to my staging area. And Git basically tells me how I'm supposed to do that. It tells me to use the git add command. Before I do that, I just want to point out that within this .git folder right now, there's not any file called index, but that's soon going to change. So I'm going to use the git add command, and I can pass in the name of the file that I want to add to the staging area. Or if I want to just do it a bit more quickly, I can just pass in a dot, which represents my current directory or my current folder. So I'm just going to do git add dot and then press enter. And what we just saw now was that this index file was created. And basically this index file is our staging area. So index and staging area are two interchangeable terms. And now if I use the git status command again, Git is telling me that there's still no commits. Once again, understandable, we haven't made any commits yet. But now there are changes to be committed. In other words, Git is telling me there is a file in your staging area that you can now include in your next commit when you make a commit. So let's go see that. So now we've copied this file over into the staging area. This is really important to note as well. Another misconception is that the file moves from the working directory into the staging area, but that's not the case. The file gets copied over from the working directory to the staging area. So files are not moved from the working directory to the staging area. Files are copied from the working directory to the staging area. So now we're basically ready to make our first commit. So in order to do that, we're going to use the git commit command and pass in the -m option to pass in a message. And I'm just going to write first commit. Normally, when you're making commits, you want to make sure to give a message that will give information on what you worked on in that version of your project. Something that will help maybe fellow developers that you're working with to understand what changes you made. So I'm going to make a commit, enter. And now if I use a command called git log, this command is going to give me a list of all my commits in my repository in reverse chronological order. At the moment, I only have one commit, so it's only going to give me this commit. But we can see here that there's the commit hash. So those 40 letters and numbers that act like a name for the commit, a way to refer to it. It gives us who made the commit, when they made the commit, and then it also gives us the commit message. So then if we go back to the diagram, we can see that now we've made our very first commit. So now let's go over the staging area in depth. So that was how to make a commit. Now we're going into the staging area. So when we made our commit, another common misconception is that our staging area is wiped clean. So now the staging area is empty because we included that file in the commit. But that's not really the case. Whenever you are working on a project, you're working on a particular version of your project. So you're on a particular commit at any point in time. And so it's the folders and files that are part of that commit that are in your staging area. So in other words, the staging area is not empty. The staging area has all the files of the commit that you're currently on. So I've prepared another project folder, and I've already added 4 files to it, chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. I've also already made an initial commit in which, as you can see here, and therefore at the moment, all the files that are in my working directory are also in my staging area because I'm currently on that commit. So let me go and show you this project. I'm going to open up a new window. The project is called Novella. It's my novella that I'm writing. So here we go, novella. We can see that there's chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. In my terminal, I'm also going to get out of the novel project folder and get into novella. Let me just clear this. And then I'm also going to do the same here, just so you can see the files. So now if I do a git status, we can see that Git is telling me that everything in my working directory and in my staging area is the same. And if I use the git log command again, which will show me all the list of commits in my repository, we can see that Git will tell me there's just one commit. I called it the initial commit. This is the commit hash. So what happens now if I want to make some changes to some of the files in this project folder so that we can see, again, more things about the staging area? So I'm going to go into chapter 3, and I'm going to add some information. Let's say chapter 3, working on this chapter, save that. And then I'm going to also make changes to chapter 4, also working on this chapter. If I really want to write a book, I would have to be a lot more inventive than this. But and now if I use the git status command to see the state of my working directory in my staging area, I'm going to see that I have modified files. I've changed some files. These updated files have not yet been added to my staging area. So if I want to add these updated files to my staging area so that I could in the future include them in my next commit, I have to use the git add command again. So we're going to use the git add command. And I'm just going to put a dot, so that's going to add them both in one go. And now if I use the git status command, we can see that now Git has added them to my staging area. And if I were to make a commit right now, both of those updated files would be part of my next commit, part of the next version of my project. So let's go see that in the diagram. So I have these. I decided to make changes, updates, add more content to chapter 3 and 4. And it's as if those files update to become the second version of those files or a newer version of the file. Then I decided to add those to my staging area. But what happens now? Oh, sorry. What happens now if I decide that the changes that I made to chapter 4 are not yet ready to be committed? I've decided that actually I'm still working on chapter 4. I don't want to include those changes in my next commit. What I mentioned previously was that the staging area is like a rough draft space. So you can basically add files and remove files in order to really, really be intentional in how you craft what you include in your commits. So if I want to remove a file from the staging area, I can still do that because I haven't made any commits. So I can use the git reset command, pass in head in capital letters, and then pass in the name of the file that I want to remove. So I'm going to say chapter4.txt. Then I'm going to press enter. And basically Git is going to tell me, okay, we've unstaged those changes. So if I type in git status now, Git is going to tell me that you have a file in your staging area that would be included in your next commit, and that's the chapter3.txt file. But then you also have a file in your working directory that has been modified, that is an updated version of that file, but that's not in your staging area anymore. So now if I make a commit, I'm just going to call it second commit. Again, normally your commit messages should be a lot more informative. And now if I do a git log, we can see that I have 2 commits. So let's go see that in the diagram. I decided that I didn't want to include the things that I changed in chapter 4. So I unstaged that file, and we can see that it reverts back to the version 1 of that file. And then I made another commit. So that was just to show that the staging area really is a rough draft space. You can really decide what do you want to include in each of your commits. And this really helps when you're working with other developers to keep your commit history clean and organized. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is branches. So branches are, I think, one of the things that are the most misunderstood in Git. In order to talk about branches, we're really going to focus on this commit history. So in order to show you where we actually can see our branches, I'm going to go into this .git folder. And then I'm going to go into this folder called refs. And then inside this folder called heads. And in there, there's a file called master. So I'm going to go into that. So what master is a branch, but what is master? What are branches? Well, inside that file called master, we have this commit hash. And this commit hash is the same commit hash that we have here. So it's the commit hash for our second commit. And what we can see is that next to this commit hash, there are these parentheses, and then you have master. So master is basically just a pointer to a commit. So branches are just pointers to commits. So let me show you that really explicitly in the diagram. So we have these two commits, and basically master is just a pointer to a commit. So this goes to show that branches are nothing like tree branches. They are just pointers to commits. And this is, I think, one of the most common false mental models that people have when they use Git. So in order to see all of the branches in our repository, we can use a command called git branch. So we can see here that there's an asterisk next to master and it's in green. So that shows you which branch you're on. In order to add a branch to our repository, we can use the git branch command again, but then we can pass in the name of a branch. So I'm going to call it feature 1. And at the moment, you can see that in our heads folder, we only have a master file. But once I make this feature 1 branch, we can see that a feature 1 file has also been added in there. And if we click into it, we can see that it actually holds the same commit hash as the master file. And if I use the git log command, I will find that now both master and feature 1 points to this commit. So if we go to the diagram, we can see that master is pointing to this commit, and then feature 1 is also pointing to this commit. And basically, whenever you make a branch, it will point to the commit you're currently on when you made the branch. So now let's figure out, what is this head? Like head in capital letters, what is that? So there's actually a file called head in our repository. We're going to click into that. And we can see here that it references in the refs folder, in the heads folder, the master file. So basically what head is it's a pointer to the branch you're currently on. So that's why head is literally pointing to master. So let's see that in the diagram. So we have our master branch and our feature 1 branch. And then we have another kind of pointer in a way that's called head that points to master because we're currently on the master branch. So just a heads up, whenever you make a branch, it doesn't mean that you switch into that branch. You have to explicitly switch into that branch. So even though we made the feature 1 branch, we're still just on the master branch. So now in order to switch branches, so in order to go onto the feature 1 branch, we use a command called git checkout, and we pass in the name of the branch we want to switch onto. So we pass in the name feature 1. So when I press enter, it's going to tell me that it's switched to branch feature 1. And then if I click into head, we will see that now it references feature 1 in there. All right. Now we can actually still make another commit, because if we use the git status command, we know we have something in our working directory that we can add to our staging area and then make another commit. So I'm just going to add that to the staging area and make our final commit. All right. And if I use the git log command now, we will see that master still points to the commit that it was pointing to before, our second commit. But now feature 1 has updated to point to our latest commit, the third commit. And that's basically because whenever you make a commit, it's the branch you're currently on when you make that commit that updates to point to the latest commit. So we made a commit. Oh, sorry, we switched on to feature 1. And then we made a commit. And then the feature 1 branch updated to point to that latest commit. So yeah, that was it. That was kind of an overview of some really, really basic things in Git. So we covered the difference between Git and GitHub, which a lot of people get kind of confused and they think they're like the same thing, very different. We covered making a commit really in depth and introduced a new kind of mental model. The staging area in depth, how it's a rough draft space, and then branches. The fact that branches are really just pointers to commits, and they are not tree branches, which a lot of other diagrams or online learning material kind of give you that impression. So yeah. These are some links to things that I'll share in the chat. But I think we can go to any questions if anyone has any questions. I don't know if it was all clear. So let me, there we go. It was helpful. All right. Does anyone have any questions? So as I mentioned, thank you. As I mentioned, this presentation is basically based off of an online course that I built while working as a developer. And the online course is basically on Udemy. So if anybody wants to check that out, I go over more things like merging, working with remote repositories, pushing your repository to GitHub, fetching changes from GitHub. I'll leave a link to the course in the chat. What else do we go over? I go over rebasing, and then some more like complex things, branching as well. And also a lot of the lessons from the course are just on my YouTube channel, so I'll leave that in the link as well. All right, great. Any other questions? Anybody? Okay, yeah, I can repeat the thing about Git versus GitHub. So basically, Git is a program that you don't download onto your computer. And it's the distributed version control system. It allows you to keep track of all the versions of your code, and it allows you to collaborate with other people. And GitHub is just a company. So it's just a company that allows you to host your projects that use Git on a remote server or in the cloud somewhere. So there's plenty of other companies. I think like DigitalOcean, I think, is one of them. Bitbucket, like there's plenty of other companies that allow you to host your projects that use Git remotely somewhere. But GitHub was just smart to use the word Git in their name, and they're the most widely used one. So that's also why they're so often people think that they're the same thing. So yeah, I hope that's clear. Carol. I wouldn't really say Git is a language. No, it's just a version control system. I wouldn't really, that's a good question, but yeah, no, I don't think I'd say Git is a language. It's just a way to keep track of the versions of your code. There are commands in it, but yeah, I wouldn't say it's a programming language. You're welcome. I hope that was helpful. Any other questions? So I used terminal to make a repository. So I use the git init command to make a repository, but you can also make repositories using some sort of graphical user interface. So a GUI, that is what they call it. Do you need to know Python to use Git? No, you don't need to know Python to use Git. You don't need to know any programming language to use Git. Honestly, you can even write a book. Like you could like I kind of did in my example. You don't need to know how to code to use Git. What Git does is it tracks the versions of your files. So if you have files in which you're just writing normal prose, like normal, just writing about your day, you can keep track of those files as well using Git. When you switch head on a project with multiple developers, who knows who has most advanced code version? Okay, so the thing is, when you're switching head, you're doing that on your local repository, not on your remote repository. So actually, it doesn't affect any of your coworkers. So yeah. Are there pros and cons to using an online repository versus Git? Is there one? So the thing is that there exists no online repository without. Okay, wait. Let me see how I can say that. Basically, if you're using Git and you're pushing that local repository to a remote repository, you're still using Git, even if you're cloning that remote repository. You're using, like, that's a Git repository. So yeah, so it's not about using an online or remote repository versus using a local repository. It's like they're the same thing, basically, in terms of, not that a local repository and a remote repository are the same thing, but you're going to be doing both if you're working with other people and collaborating. Is it up to developers then to check they are not rolling back code inadvertently? So the thing is, how to explain? First of all, Git is very smart. So unless you do any very dangerous things with Git, you're probably not going to lose any code. So most likely when you're working with other developers on a project with a remote repository, you're going to be using pull requests. So it's usually quite controlled how the code changes. And you're going to be deciding whether you want to merge your branches, or if you want to accept a pull request, which is going to be work that another developer has done on a branch. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about rolling back code inadvertently. Git is very smart, and remote repositories have checks in place so that remote developers can work smoothly together. Any other questions? I hope that's kind of clear. It's a bit complex. I'll be honest, I go over, remote repositories in the course, but also there's tons of online resources. There's a book called Pro Git, which is basically the Bible when it comes to Git. So I highly recommend that book as well. It's available for free online, as like the PDF version of it. So yeah, I highly recommend that. Any other questions? Is there anything people would like to learn more about? What are the topics that people are more, like if there was a second workshop that they would like covered? Or otherwise, is there any feedback as well? I'm open to feedback. Is there anything that people find the most confusing when they use Git, perhaps? Yeah, I like the idea of writing a book with Git, and that's also why the reason that I use that as my example in the presentation is because I really want, first of all, I really wanted to just focus on Git instead of confusing people with different programming languages and file structures. And yeah, I mean, Git can be used for many different things. It doesn't just have to be for coding or programming, although that's what it's mostly used for. Yeah, it's a very big subject. Git can do a lot of things. This is honestly just scratching the surface. It's a very, very powerful tool. All right, second workshop, would like to see how to do recovering crashes on Git commits. Yeah, so interesting. Well, if we created any bi-weekly Git writing club, I would definitely let you know, Carol. that maybe I should look into that, because I'm a writer myself as well, so I like writing as well. Any other questions? All right, I think if there's not any other questions, maybe, does anybody have any questions? I need to find out more. Okay, yeah. Perhaps if anyone has any questions about CodeOp as well that organized this workshop, They're a coding bootcamp for anyone that missed in the beginning. They're a coding bootcamp headquartered in Barcelona, but working remotely as well. And they offer programs in full stack development, data analytics, and product management. So yeah, reach out to them if you're interested in learning any of those. Highly recommend. They have incredible programs. I've worked with them. Great. I don't know, Amefa, do you want to say anything?
No, if there's nothing else and no further questions or any contributions, I think we could bring it to an end. Okay, there is a...
Yeah. What preparation coding do I need before using Git? You don't need any. I mean, all you have to do to use Git is to download it on your computer. Other than that, you don't need anything else. You don't need to know how to code. Like I showed, you can just write normal prose. You can write normal files with text. So Git is very user-friendly to get started with in terms of not needing to learn to code another language. It's not very user-friendly in terms of how it works. That can take a while to wrap our minds around.
Yes. Any more? Does Git compress files or does it double the computer disk? Anna, there's one more question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Honestly, I can't confidently say exactly how it does the like really, really, really deep stuff. I mean, there are still things about Git that I don't know, the like really deep internals. It definitely does compress. I mean, it definitely like doesn't take up a lot of space at all. Like that's the whole point of Git. It's really, really intelligent in how it version controls things. But I don't know if that's called compressing or if there's another term for that. But it definitely doesn't double the computer disk space used. I mean, Git is very light. That is definitely something I can tell you. Okay, interesting. So about people who are starting their careers in tech. So should I maybe share a bit of my story, my journey in the tech space? So just like CodeUp, I went to, unfortunately, CodeUp wasn't running yet when I did my coding bootcamp. Otherwise, I would definitely have gone there. Great coding bootcamp. So I myself attended a coding bootcamp here in Barcelona, and I ended up getting a job as a front-end developer. After my coding bootcamp, I created a video in which I did a demo of the app that I had built while in my coding bootcamp. And as anybody else in the tech industry, I also just did a lot of applications, made sure my GitHub was up to date with any projects that I was working on. And I was really lucky. On the same floor as my coding bootcamp, because my coding bootcamp was based in a co-working space, there was another company looking for junior developers. And after applying, I got that position. But I don't know if Steph, maybe you have a particular industry or what exactly, do you have any more specific questions about getting started in tech? I would recommend just making sure that you communicate everything that you're learning online so that people can hear about the things that you're learning and the new skills you're acquiring. Because obviously, unless you share them online, nobody's going to know about them, especially if you're switching careers and getting into a new industry. Okay. All right. There's no more other questions. Okay. I think we can wrap it up, right? MF, I don't know if you want to say anything final about CodeUp.
No, I think you've covered everything, and it's good if there's any further questions. So just as a follow-up, tomorrow you would receive an email with a recording of this workshop for those who couldn't catch it in the beginning, or just in case you want to refresh up from time to time, you would receive an email with a recording of it. as well as a survey to give feedback on maybe other things you'd like to see or other courses in the future that or workshops you'd be interested in as well. So just keep an eye out for that email, and I'm sure we'll see you around at another workshop we offer or we organize. Yeah, somebody says I'm looking into design related things specifically, but learning. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Awesome.
So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you for joining, and have a good evening. Bye.
Yeah. Bye, guys.